Great. Thanks, Honey. Welcome, everybody. This is MadJS. If you're not looking for JavaScript discussions, then you're in the wrong place. I'm standing in for Eric. He could not make these in Chicago. About to have a baby or two. So just going to go over his slides, and then we'll turn it over to people. Just briefly mention that all of these presentations for the past few years are on YouTube now, thanks to Hani. He's been doing a great job recording, and I think we all appreciate being able to review the videos from the past sessions. It takes a couple of weeks probably before the sessions come online.
Depending how busy I am.
Right, and how hard it is to process, but we all appreciate it. So
Thank you.
thank you, Honey. I guess there's also t-shirts available. You can go there, screen.com, MadJS, you get MadJS swag. We also do have a website, madjavascript.com, and on there you can find our code of conduct, etc. So, wanted to pass this on to Kevin.
Hey everybody.
Centaur.
Hey everybody, my name is Kevin. I'm with Centaur. I'm actually a recruiter with Centaur and been working with Eric and a little bit with Jazz on setting this up. We're really honored to sponsor this. I know we're trying to obviously get our name out there a lot more in the Madison area. I'm not sure how many of you guys know about Centaur. I've heard of us before. Okay, so a couple. We're actually based in Brookfield. That's where our corporate headquarters is, and we have an office now here on the east side of Madison. And we're a custom software development organization, and we also have a agile coaching and training side to our business. So real quickly, I won't bore you too long because I know the main event is Leo, but we can either help develop software for our clients in a couple of different ways. We have full-time staff consultants who can go out to clients and work at their facilities for a duration of time, or we can do the development from our offices. So if an organization wanted to outsource some work to us, we could do it from our buildings in Madison or Brookfield. We have a full development team with obviously developers, QA, UI, UX, basically anything needed to complete a project from start to finish. And we can also teach organizations how to develop software better and faster through agile methodologies, in particular Scrum or Kanban. That's something else we can help with as well. We have about 140 employees through our 3 territories. We also have a small presence right now down in Chicago. So with that said, I'd be remiss as a recruiter that I did not mention that we're always looking for software developers. So I don't know if anyone here is looking, or if you know someone is looking, but I put on each of your chairs just some more information about Centaur and my business card. I'd love to talk to any one of you or anyone you know who's looking, whether it's just a coffee meeting where we talk about Centaur. It doesn't have to be right out of the gates, come work for Centaur, just more of an information gathering. There's a ton of pizza here. Unfortunately, I can't stick around, so I can't take the pizza if there's leftover, but I encourage if anybody sees something that they like or want to take home to go ahead and do that. So I don't want to take up too much more time because I know Leo's got a good presentation for you guys, but as I mentioned, I got my business cards on the chair there, so if anybody needs to reach out to me or would like to reach out to me, please do so.
Thanks for the pizza.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, guys.
And just regarding the pizza, please take them.
Yes.
And actually, I'd appreciate it if somebody helps clean up afterwards too with the pizza. That would be useful. So, any other announcements, job openings, people looking for jobs, or other cool JavaScript things? Go ahead.
So, December 3rd, we're running a Node school in room 301. So if you want to learn more about writing Node or JavaScript in general, or if you know someone that's like a beginning programmer, They could come to Node School. It's self-guided tutorials with mentors to help work with people who may not be as knowledgeable with JavaScript as us. So if you're interested, it's on Meetup.com under MadJS, and it's December 3rd.
Is it for a fee?
It is free.
It's free?
It's free. Food will be provided.
Oh, thanks.
And that's just, it's the first, so there's going to be multiple, but this is just the first one.
What level? Are you starting out entry level? Or,
Yeah.
And what level do you think
It's
it would
going to
get
be more self-guided, so there'll be
Fair enough.
entry. People who are more experienced will be working in more experienced tutorials.
Right, cool. Any other announcements?
I guess I could say one. I work at Ionic, and tomorrow we're having a sneak peek at Ionic version 2. If you've ever heard of the Ionic framework, it's for hybrid applications. It's a framework for hybrid applications. So we're having a sneak 2 at our version 2 tomorrow at the office. It's 121 Pinckney Street. You can find it on meetup.com. If you're interested.
Okay.
A few fans are on the center.
Cool. Glad to hear.
All right, great. So I'm going to turn it over to Leo. He's going to talk about Ember, and that's it.
So as this is coming up, has anybody actually used Ember yet, or played with it, or even looked at it? Okay, can't just make stuff up. Okay. All right, good to know. Well, thank you everybody for coming. Hopefully you'll find this a bit useful. We're going to see a little bit of Ember. I'm also going to talk kind of in a broader sense, but there is going to be a demo, so we'll just get right into it, which is not what I wanted to do. There we go. Fanciness. So I'm Leo Carbajal. I work for Center. I don't need to give a speech because that was done for me. I like making things fit in on slides. You're going to see a lot of that. I'm not going to apologize. I like it. I also like JavaScript. Hopefully everybody else does too. I have a Twitter account and a Facebook account, but I don't use them, and I don't blog, so you don't get any links from me, except for this one. I'll show you my gits. GitHub.com/Vassi, V-A-S-S-I. You'll find the demo code in there. I don't remember if I put the slide deck there, but if I didn't, I will shortly. So if there's anything in the slides you want to see or the demo you want to kind of review, call me out. It's all there. Brief soapbox moment. Not going to get too much into this because I usually give this talk to non-JavaScript people. But I like to talk about when in Rome. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. And the importance of using things in their native environment. So you're trying a new framework. I'm going to pick on Aurelia because I can. You're following their guide, and there's like, install this, download these files, run JSPM commands, etc. And then you're at a hackathon. I've seen this happen. You're at a hackathon, and you're like, I don't like JSPM. It's dumb. It's downloading 300 files all the time. I'm going to use Webpack. And then 4 or 5 hours later, you haven't gotten Webpack to work because Webpack. And then by the end of the hackathon, you've gotten maybe a Hello World page on the screen, and you're like, man, Aurelia sucks. And you didn't really evaluate the framework, right? You just kind of failed to resist the urge to optimize. And so, yeah, Aurelia takes the blame. Maybe it deserves it, maybe it doesn't, but just keep in mind, important to try things as they're prescribed. You want to kind of learn the framework as it's presented to you before you can really make decisions on whether it's for you or not. There's always technical reasons not to, but so yeah. So try new things. Also important to keep in mind, most frameworks can do all the things, right? So Angular can do it, can do spas. Durandal can do spas. I know Durandal, gross. Angular can do all the things. So really just pick a tool, right, that works for you, that you're going to be proficient with. Doesn't mean don't try things, but just keep it all in context. Sometimes you just need a library, right? Maybe you just need some binding, you need some knockout, maybe you just need some fast rendering from a static JSON tree. you're going to use React, that's fine. Maybe you just need HTML, little jQuery validation. Come on, everybody still gets done with that sometimes. It's important not to get carried away with our frameworks, right? We all like them, but keep it in perspective. All right, let's talk about Ember. So a couple things about Ember. It was created on December 2011th. I say created in quotes because Ember kind of evolved from Sprout Core. I don't know if anybody's heard of Sprout Core before. It's basically a widget library. Some people compare it to XJS. I think that's a travesty to one of the two of them, depending. I'll let you decide. So around 2011, Sprout Core decided they wanted the 2.0 version, and they wanted to expose some of the kind of MVC stuff that they were doing under the covers. And Ember kind of just birthed from that effort. And they went their separate ways, and then Sprout Core is like, hey, here's more widgets. And some people paid attention. So Ember is sponsored by multiple companies, unlike Angular, which is Google, and React, which is Facebook. Ember is primarily sponsored by Yahoo and LinkedIn, but they're mostly consumers of the framework. They don't really own the framework. And then on that note, IE8 and above are supported, so if you're stuck with IE8 for some reason, I'm sorry, you can use Ember versions 1.13 and under. If you're using 2.0 plus, then you're stuck with IE9 and above. It's pretty standard. I don't think even Angular supports IE8 really anymore. Who uses Ember? It's kind of a necessary bullet point, right? Well, Apple uses Ember. I believe their music store was at some point, or is still, an Ember app. Microsoft uses Ember a lot internally for various development tasks, and Netflix uses it a lot, it turns out. They do a lot of customer service tools. So if you ever call for like tech support and they need to go all Big Brother on you and look at what you've been watching and your bitstream and all that stuff, that's all with Ember. So at the same time, though, all those places, they use Angular, they use Backbone, they use React, they use all those things too. So I'm not trying to pretend. So why Ember? If it's been around since 2011, why are we making a big deal out of it? And by we, I mean me. Why am I making a big deal out of it? One of the kind of traditional pain points with Ember is documentation. If you've ever tried to use Ember in the past 2 years or so, it's been kind of a nightmare in that you go and you find an answer for something, you hit a wall, and yeah, you might find plenty of answers, but they're all outdated. It's because Ember kind of was moving very quickly at some points, especially when it first hit 1.0. And so there wasn't a lot of stability in their documentation. The API was changing very, very quickly. It was hard to keep up with what was canary, what's beta, what's stable. And to a certain extent, that's all improved. If you go to EmberJS.com now, they have two very important sections. One is called Guides. And for the guides, you'll find basically it's a walkthrough style type of documentation where they're like, here's how you start, here are these Ember concepts, and it's kind of very shallow, but it introduces you to the big, basically what I'm doing. So those guides are completely making me superfluous. So then you have the API, and the API is going to give you all the specifics, like all the properties and the events of a specific object. And those are pretty well up to date as well. They're written by the developers, and in some cases they are more up to date. So that's improved. There's also this very rich build environment around Ember right now. And by that I mean almost exclusively Ember CLI. There's a very well established kind of pipeline for your build, so you can just get started very quickly. And we'll talk more about Ember CLI. Additionally, the community is extremely active. They have a very active forum on EmberJS, and then Stack Overflow is very active, and they have there's like this website dedicated to just what's the word I'm looking for? Screencasts of Ember tutorials and things like that. So a lot of activity right now in the community. Very rich add-on community too, which we're gonna definitely talk about. And then Ember, most importantly, one of the things you want in your framework, right, is you want that framework to evolve and respond to what everybody else is doing, and not just what everybody else is doing, but what its users are doing. And Ember's done this very well. An example of this is back in Ember 1.8 and before, templating was not so great for Ember because they primarily use Handlebars. Familiar with Handlebars? It's pretty much just a string templating library, right? It takes this thing and it makes a string out of it. It doesn't really know what you're doing with that string. For Ember to use it in some ways, it did some weird things. So like my first example up there, I have just a link, and I need to bind the href to it. And I had to use this bind adder helper, which is not the end of the world, but it's not the best. And that was the case for any attribute. That's because Handlebars had no real concept of the DOM and what an element was. But the far more heinous problem was if I had a span and I just wanted to write a name on it, it would render this monstrosity of the span and then a starting script, your information, and an ending script. And Ember used to use these as placeholders. So whenever it needed to update the data, it would find those scripts numbered appropriately, and it would kind of replace your data in there. That was horrible for lots of reasons. One of the biggest ones is, it makes your HTML look ugly. And the second one is your styles are just broken now. If you were relying on nth child or anything like that, now you have to account for all these extra elements in there that you were not expecting. So, as of February of this year, Ember started to get its act together in terms of the templating and UI stuff. And they evolved Handlebars into HTML bars. By the way, small aside, Handlebars is created by the same guy that wrote Ember. So they took Handlebars and kind of forked it and made HTML bars. And now HTML bars is much more aware of the DOM. It's not just a string anymore, a string templating library. It's more of a tokenizer and a really good, more appropriate parser. So now you can do things like just bind directly into an attribute like you're more used to. It feels more natural to do so. And now when you use bindings inside your DOM, it just works like you're expecting it to. And then as of June of this year, they rolled out this kind of behind-the-scenes update to the rendering engine named Glimmer. And it was kind of a running joke that Ember was very slow for very complicated pages. So what they ended up doing was putting up this website called isemberfastyet.com. And you'd browse to that thing, and it was just a giant no, just no. But as of June, now it says yes, big fat yes. 4,800 tests for this rendering engine. And then they've got a link under it that I encourage you to check out at some point. It's basically hooked up to all these databases, and it's like, I don't know, dozens of just little blinking lights and updating statuses, and gives you a good impression of how much better the rendering engine is. Like you can just scroll through that thing while it's changing, and it barely stutters. In fact, for me, it doesn't. So that's Glimmer, and all you had to do was upgrade to 1.13. No syntax changes, nothing. You just got that performance. So, and then there's their release cycle. So Ember is pretty. We've already said Ember kind of releases fairly quickly. This is a screenshot from their kind of builds site a couple weeks ago. I believe 2.1 just came out literally this week. But what they do is they use Semver, which long or short story is basically with Semver, what they're saying is when you have a 1.0 release, any 1.0 releases that come after that one are not going to break your code, right? Any minor versions are not going to break your code. They're going to add more features maybe. Maybe it's going to deprecate some things that you've been using, but it should never break your code. You can just upgrade and take advantage of any performance increases, etc. And so what they've done is with Ember 2.0 is kind of interesting because it's not really a huge change in Ember. What they've done is all the things that have been deprecated through the 1.0 cycle, in 2.0 they were just chopped off. So if you want to migrate to Ember 2.0, all you basically need to do is upgrade to 1.13. Nothing should break, but you'll get probably a slew of deprecation warnings. And if you fix all those deprecation warnings, then you're good to go. You just upgrade to 2.0, and you're set, right, for the new cycle. So let's talk a little bit more about how Ember works. 15 minutes-ish. Should probably not be a problem, but there is some ES6 syntax in the demo and in the slides. If you haven't seen it, then it should still be fairly natural. If for whatever reason you don't understand it, feel free to ask a question. Or tell me I typoed. I like that one. All right, so the Ember page, this is a tech presentation, so I felt I needed a box diagram of some kind. So I went with this, and the top thing is the URL, which is weird. It seems weird to some people, but Ember's pretty big on, Ember's for web, and the web likes URLs. So one of the things that is core and central to Ember is the URL. Like all your Ember applications should start with a map of what URLs your screens are going to be at. And the reasoning behind that is a good URL scheme will organize your app in an effective fashion. Kind of like when you're designing an API. It's very much the same thing, just on your UI side. And the reason you need to do this is because the router is core to Ember. So if you don't give them a URL, then you're implicitly kind of applying for one to the router when you set your routes. So here's an Ember router. I've got 3 routes, items, a nested route under items, and then another item route. And for that one, I actually supplied a path. So if my domain is leo.com, I'm saying leo.com/item/id, right? That's going to take me to that last route. And then leo.com/items is what I'm saying is my first route. And then that nested route is going to be at leo.com/items/new. Not too surprising, but again, if you don't provide your URL, Ember will give you one. So routes, every screen has a route. They're not really optional. Like I said, the router is core to Ember. And routes are singletons, which is only important in the sense that it's actually not expected. A lot of people that are new to Ember don't expect routes and later controllers to be singletons, so they'll do things like set properties on them, and then when the screen is taken off, you browse somewhere else and you come back to it, you're surprised that your state is still there. It's because it's a singleton. That's not actually as big a problem as you think it is, as long as you keep in mind that it is a singleton when you're developing. So the route's job is usually to fetch your model. So if you think about like a typical, well, I don't know if it's typical, but in the .NET world, it's typical to have like a 3-tier application. You have your data, right? Your data, your controllers, your web layer, and then your UI layer. So the route can kind of be considered your data layer. It's really kind of, its job is to fetch your models and maybe maintain those model states. So if you're going to launch a save operation, it's probably your route that wants to do that. Again, routes are created by Ember unless you provide one. So it's kind of optional. Sounds weird if you're not used to it. We'll see examples of that. And then routes are promise aware. That means that in your route, when you're fetching your model, there's a model hook where you can do that, and you return a promise. The router knows how to deal with that promise, so it'll display a loading state if you've provided one, and if your promise hits an error, then it goes to your error state if you've provided one. You don't really have to think about how those things are done. You just say, here's a loading template, and Ember will go and find it. So this router is leagues above like UI router, NG router, if you're familiar with those. The router for Ember is way above that stuff. It does a lot of heavy lifting. So this is the simplest route you are likely to type. If you ever just need a route and you don't actually need to do anything in it, you don't actually have to create the object, right? Because Ember is going to make one for you. But if you do, this is kind of what you do. So here I'm importing a service, right? And then it's called an item service, and then I'm getting that item service and ostensibly retrieving some items that's probably returning an AJAX or promise. And then when that promise resolves, the router is going to provide the result set to the controller, and everybody's happy. So again, another example of kind of all the things that the router can do for you. The route exposes all these lifecycle hooks. We're not going to go over each one in depth, but basically allows you to do a lot of things. So model is the most common one, right? You fetch your data there. You can also do work before that call or after that call, right? After you have your model, maybe you want to make more decisions. Maybe you need to redirect. Maybe you are expecting an array, but you only get one result. You can just kind of transition into like the details page, right? You can do that at the after model once you have that information. Set up your controller, you can reset it, and then the will transition did transition stuff. It's great for analytics if you need to track analytics. That's where you would do that. And then if you don't trust just the kind of blanket loading and error states, you can actually capture them here and do something with it. And the kind of nice thing is that all these route events some of these route events kind of bubble up. So like if you have an application route at the very base of your app, you can define an error thing there and kind of catch global errors if they've bubbled up that far. Same thing with loading. So models, we're not going to spend too much time talking about because any old JS thing can be a model, right? It's basically just your data. So that usually comes from like an async call, some kind of service. There is this whole Ember data thing. If you've looked into Ember at all, I know you've heard of Ember data. We're not going to talk too much about it because it's really all or nothing. It's like another mini framework, basically. I like to think of it as an ORM, which means once you subscribe to it, it owns all your data, basically. It owns what your data looks like, because you have to define models. It owns how it's going to query your data and how it's going to keep your data and store. There's a lot of customization you can do to it, but it's well beyond the scope. It's like a whole 2-hour presentation. Then we have controllers, and those are also singletons. The controllers receive their models from the route, as we've already kind of mentioned. And in that respect, they kind of behave a lot more like view models, if you're familiar with the kind of the MVVM framework pattern, I should say. Controllers kind of fit more in view models in that they kind of decorate your data, and their job is really to keep the application state. So if you need any state just to manage your screen, right, like what's collapsed, what's not collapsed, that stuff's going to live in the controller more than likely. So again, controllers are created by Ember unless you provide one. Sounds super weird, again, but if you don't need a controller to decorate your model, you don't make one. And Ember just does the right thing behind the scenes to keep itself running. So because of kind of some of these reasons and components, which we'll talk about later, controllers are actually starting to fade away as a thing that you have to deal with. And I only mention it because at some point in the 2.0 lifecycle, you'll probably see controllers just kind of not be used very much. So templates are the next kind of component of the page, and templates are rendered by the router or a component. Controllers really don't have any say in, well, they don't have much say, let's leave it at that, into what a template is. Templates are handlebars based still, so kind of the curly braces. Everybody's used to those, right? Angular uses the same syntax. One important thing, though, is Ember does not support, by choice, any inline JavaScript or logic of any kind, and not even like a custom expression syntax. You just can't do it. Basically, everything is done via calculated properties or other model properties or actions that are defined on your controllers and components. There is the option to make like a Handlebars Helper, which is kind of akin to a directive, but not really, if you're familiar with Angular. And but really, they really want you to not use JavaScript. So don't, you're not going to be writing any equals this or dot length is greater than 0. You're not going to be doing that. You're going to be making a computed property that calculates that for you. So here's a template. It's not earth-shattering, right? We have some HTML. We've got an each helper there, and that's just going to iterate over the model, which in this case is an array. And then we've got this campaign card thing, and that's actually a component. So we're passing some properties into a component here. And kind of one of the nice things that Ember components do is if you look at campaign and selected, for selected we're delegating an action, right? We're passing an action down for that component to use for us. And then for campaign, we're actually just passing the model through, right? And the component's probably going to do some more rendering for us. But this class thing, that's just the HTML class attribute. So that's just going to get merged with whatever the component is doing. So that's kind of cool. And then we have outlet, which is very similar to like UI view for a UI router. It just tells your template where any nested routes are going to render. So then we have components, and components do have a life cycle. They're not singletons. They get created when they're rendered and destroyed when they are de-rendered. Is that a word? It's a word. So components live very close to the DOM as a result of that, and they're typically the ones that are the components, they're the things that are handling native events in your applications. So you'll be able to just like define a click event, and on mouse click on that component, that's going to get activated. Components can do all of those things, so they can do all the DOM stuff, but they also do basically everything that a controller can do. So they decorate your model. You'll have calculated properties based on your model, etc. And so as part of the 2.0 cycle, there's going to be a routable component created which is essentially going to put the controller out to pasture in a lot of ways. So you'll be able to route straight to a component instead of needing a controller. So, oh, this is my favorite. So in Ember, the components are kind of the centerpiece of their data down, actions up kind of methodology. And really, data down, actions up is just, it's kind of the React way of thinking, right? If you've ever spent any time looking into React, that model says your data is like a stream, right? It's got one point of origin, and you should only ever make changes to your data at its point of origin, right? So you shouldn't let anything downstream of your data make changes to it, because then it's harder to maintain. It's harder to understand where those changes are happening in your application and what's making the changes, and it becomes harder to manage, especially for complicated applications. So Ember takes this and kind of tries to run with it. And so that model kind of looks like this, right? You have a route, and your route is going to fetch your models. It's going to hit up your JavaScript services, maybe Ember data. It's going to fetch that, and then it's going to set that on the controller. The controller is going to make some computed properties based around your model, but it's never going to change your model, right? So then it's going to talk to the components in a template and pass some more data down for them to render. Maybe it's going to delegate some actions down there so that when the component gets that, it's going to render it on the screen, and it's going to start listening for input, right? You're subscribing to events, clicks, etc. But the component itself is not going to mutate the data. So then we have the upside here. So components, they're going to invoke your action, right? So the controller set an action on the component, and when you click on a component, interact with it, it's going to send that action up to the controller. If it deals with the screen state, then the controller is going to take that into account, make its changes, and when that and if it needs to go further up, like you need to save a model, it's going to bubble that up still to the route. The route is going to mutate your model, and then all this stuff is going to flow back down the hill, basically. And your components are going to get re-rendered, and now when you're maintaining your app, you know exactly where all the code is. So that's kind of super brief, data down, actions up. Okay. Any questions so far? No? I will switch this. There's no way you can read that, right? It's pretty small. All right, so I have this empty directory, and I've already got all my global NPM Ember CLI stuff installed. So I'm just going to start it. This is basically how you create an Ember app. Okay, you do Ember init, and then I'm going to provide a name. I'm just going to go with cookbook, cook. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's just going to hit up NPM and start downloading all the things. So what I want to talk about while it's doing that is two websites that are kind of core to if you're going to be developing with Ember, other than just EmberJS, which you should go to for guides and API and stuff. You're probably going to be using Ember CLI. So Ember CLI is pretty cool. They've got a pretty cool site. They've got a lot of text. There's a lot of text here. So if going to the Ember CLI site is basically RTFMing, right? You're going to read the manual. You're going to come here. If you need to know how to customize the build or deployment process, you're going to be hitting some configuration file that is relevant as part of the Ember CLI installation. So you can see here they have instructions on how to get started. So you're going to need Ember CLI. You're going to need to install Bower. If you're on OS X, you're going to install Watchman. It's not required, but it improves your build. All kinds of other stuff. So if we look in the menu, there's how to test, so how they put that together, all the ASIC compilations. So if you need to do like SAS or less, this is how you get directions on how to do that. All that stuff, it's great, it's fancy. If you use Windows, which I do, I find this funny. So apparently Microsoft was trying to use Ember CLI, and they realized, hey, this is really slow on a Windows machine. And they wrote an add-on that you just install into your Ember app, or you can install it globally. And when you run it, all it's doing is it's disabling Windows Search Indexer and the Windows Defender. and it gives you like 15 seconds plus to your build step. It's kind of crazy. So anyway, that's in there. They kind of spell it out. Some other things you can do, like running as administrator, kind of improves stuff. So yeah, so all of that is in here. Highly recommended read if you're curious about whether Ember CLI is going to work with your kind of deployment step or your deployment stuff. Maybe you have automated builds. You can kind of look in here and see what you can customize and what you can't. So you can kind of determine if it's even worth trying in a project. So there's that. The other thing that we're going to be looking at is Ember add-ons here. And one of the add-ons in particular that I'm going to be using is a validation add-on. So what I can do here on this site, and the last time I demoed this 2 weeks ago, there was only 1,400 add-ons. And today there's 1,543. I don't know what that means. Apparently there's a lot of people that have adopted Ember in the last 2 weeks. So perfect timing. I totally timed that. So if I wanted to install an add-on, which is what I'm going to do, I would do Ember CP validations, which is the name of it. And then again, hit up npm. So while it's doing that, I can just kind of show you how I found that. And all I was looking for was validations. And so this list filtered, and I was able to sort by score, which is an interesting mechanic because first of all, you get a very nice list. Some of them have demos. You can easily go to them. There's a similar Angular site. I think it's like NG modules or something. I'm proud to report there is more add-ons now on this than on that site. So there you go. Take that for what it's worth. But this number is interesting because it's not just a review score. It also gives you a bit about the health of the project. So it gives them a point if there's been a release in the last 3 months, a point if there's been a commit in the last 3 months, a point if there's more than one contributor, and also they get points for being like in the top 10% of add-ons. So that's not to say when you're kind of looking for stuff that say like a 6 isn't good. It just means that something with a 9 is probably healthier, probably has more contributors, more people kind of looking at it. So it gives you kind of a pretty decent indication of health of code. And then of course you get updated, so you don't get stuck with like this awesome module that was last updated 3 years ago, which is horrible. All right, so we're going to be using Ember CP validations, and this is already installed. So I'm just going to kind of take a look at what Ember has given me. And Adam takes a bit of its time, I apologize. Okay, so this is kind of the skeleton that Ember CLI makes for you. And we're kind of looking at the router right now. As you can see, it's empty. And hopefully you can see, it's pretty big. From the folder perspective, there's not too much exciting going on here. This is all configuration, mumbo jumbo, right? Watchman, Ember CLI, package.json, Bower, everybody wants a configuration file. For the most part, you don't touch those. Ember CLI tends to manage all that stuff, and NPM does, and all that stuff. So really the exciting part is the app folder, right? That's where you're going to be doing all your stuff. And there's really only one important file. So whenever you're looking at an Ember app, you always start at the router because it's going to tell you where everything is. So in this case, it's empty, but one thing I can show you is there is this template here called application. And if you'll recall, I mentioned that Ember gives you a free route when you start, and that's the application route. But if you go look in controllers and routes, you're not going to find it because it's just basic. You're not doing anything with it. So Ember's just going to kind of create one. And all that the default is going to do is it's going to find a template named application, and it's going to render that. So that's not very exciting. But another nice thing that Ember does is, or the CLI does, I should say, is if I want to generate a route, I can use this fancy command line. And you're asking yourself, well, I could just file new. And you'd be absolutely correct. But one of the nice things that this does for you is if I run this, you can see it's created a login file in the routes folder. So that's my route. It's created a login template in my template folder. For the meantime, it's going to assume I don't want a controller. But if I do, I would just EmberG controller and do that right now. Most importantly, it's going to make a unit test for me to ignore and be shamed by for the rest of my life, or until I test it, but probably the rest of my life. So that's kind of nice. And then you can see it also just updated my file. It's actually really good about doing this. Like if you do nested stuff and you manually do stuff, it still figures it out. I don't know. It's magic. I'm easily impressed. I don't know what to say. So we have a login route, and it's very simple, right? It's just extending. If I don't actually need this, I would just delete it, because this is not useful. It's not required. So Ember's big thing is not to have you write boilerplate more than you have to, and this is one of those things. Okay, so this is not very exciting. So I'm going to, well, I'm not going to promise you exciting at all, but I'm going to go ahead and close this and switch to another demo. I think it's in here. Okay, I'm just going to start this. So to start your kind of dev environment, you're going to run Ember server. And that runs just an Express server with live reload on it after it compiles your code. And it's kind of nice because it can also proxy. So if you're developing an API, you can kind of configure it to proxy to that API. So it's you can keep your two things in sync. While it's doing that, I'm going to open Atom again. Kind of show you what's new. So in this application, I've done something a little different. I've decided I want to use this pod or feature type of organization. And to enable that in the config file, I would go and add this pod module prefix. So I'm saying cookbook, which represents my app folder. In cookbook pods, that's where my features are going to live. So then if I look in here under app in pods, I have folders that are kind of named after things now. So if I look in my route folder now, in my router, I have more routes now. So I have login, recipes, a 404 route, which I'm just catching kind of anything that I haven't defined, and my cleverly named error route. So now I've got a folder for application, and I've got this route object here. So now when Ember goes to look for my application route, it knows it's an application under the route file. And all I'm doing is if something manages to bubble up to this route, I'm just going to transition to my oh no route, which is probably going to have some kind of hipster error message because that's web 3 point whatever we're on. So that's great. And then I've got my template file in here, and this is, again, because the application is the root, this is kind of my layout page, if you will. So I've got some nav elements in here, a bunch of stuff I copied and pasted probably, some links in here, and then I've got my outlet, which is where my main application is going to render. So this should have run, maybe. It's still building. Oh, I'm not running as admin. That's why. Okay. Apologize, 1 second. So I mentioned if you're running Ember CLI on Windows, you have to run your console as administrator, because Broccoli, which is their kind of builder, likes to use symlinks to do all of its building, and that's extremely slow if it does not have administrator rights. So fair warning if you're on Windows, you'll need to know that. That's actually kind of true of any JS build you want to do, in my opinion. But all right, so we actually need to wait for this a bit. All right, so that's complete. So I can now go in here. So localhost. This is interesting. It basically tells you how long certain parts of your app take to render or build. So if you're having some kind of bottleneck, that helps you. All right, so this is the app. You saw kind of this boilerplate, this nav stuff. We're going to deal mostly with this login page today. And there's nothing fancy about this login page. It's just some basic HTML right now. So if I look at login, right, template, all I have is a template. And all it is just straight HTML. So I've got a username. I have some messaging here for my validation error. And I've got a button. And that's pretty much what we're going to work with today. So, to save a little time, I'm going to cheat, because I'm a developer. I do that. As soon as I remember. All right. So all this, I'm just skipping ahead here a little bit. And all I've really done so far is we've got this input. Now instead of being HTML, it's using a helper, right? Nothing really changed other than I've now got a value on here, no quotes, so I'm just data binding here. So I'm data binding to a username property, I'm data binding to a password property, and then now for my button, I'm registering an action to that. I'm saying when this is clicked, by default, send the submit login action. And it's going to send the submit login action to my controller, which I now have a file for in my login folder. And my controller is also very simple. I've got a submit login action, and all it's doing is alerting. So when I try to submit, I just spit back your username, because that's how I learned submit forms. That's what I learned they do. So if I try Bob, I can try to log in, and I get my alert, right? Nothing earth-shattering yet. So what we want to do is add some validation to this, and we're going to use that library that I pulled. So again, interest of time, apologize if I'm cheating, but it is 7. So we'll do validations. So now my controller has changed just a bit. I'm importing this validation mixin thing, and I'm in this pod, right? So I'm basically using import syntax to say I want the module that's in this relative to me. And once I have this mixin, I'm going to go ahead and push it into the controller. And you can push as many mixins as you want. This is kind of a params operation. In fact, when you're putting in your details, your object there, you're essentially inline creating a mixin. So my action has changed just a little bit. Now I'm using this validations attribute, which is coming from my mixin, and we'll see that in a second. So now basically what I'm saying is when everything is valid, then I'm going to alert submit, because good development practices. If I look at my mixin, this is basically straight up out of their documentation. Okay, when I did Ember install Ember CP validations, that made their namespaces available to my application. So now I'm just importing their validator and build functions, and I'm using them to export a mixin of my own. And I'm saying, hey, username and password, their presence should be true. I guess we can't say required anymore. It's presence now. Most of the validation libraries do this. But hey, it sounds kind of neat. So your presence is required. True. Yes. Let's go. So that goes on the controller. And then for our templates, we have a lot of text added here. So now we want to add a class, right? So if the validation username is invalid, then we want to add this this invalid class. And then likewise, this validations.adders, by the way, is provided by Ember CP validations. That's why we're using it. So basically, everything that I defined gets put into this adders collection, and I can access their is invalid, is valid, and then their message or their array of messages if I want it. So that's what we're doing here in the span. Now, instead of having a static message, we're saying whatever the validator gives us, and we're doing the same for password, and then our button is still doing its action here. So now if I come here to my form, I can immediately see I have validation errors. It says the field can't be blank because that's kind of the default validation message provided by the mixin. But as soon as I type something in, that's no longer invalid because now I've provided something. So I can click login. It's not going to work because they're not both valid. And now that they're both valid, I can just go ahead and submit. Yay, data binding. But this is still not very useful, right? We don't like eager validation. It's not a great experience. You don't want to go to a form and immediately see a bunch of errors, right? So what we're going to do is use this other mixin that I've created. And this one is just straight up Ember mixin, right? Saying ember.mixin.create. And I'm saying I want to display a validation attribute, and that's going to default to false. And then I'm going to use this computed function to make a computed property. But Ember gives you a bunch of things they call macros. And that's basically just common functionality so that you don't have to type it as much. So one of these is alias. So because I'm lazy, I don't want to type validation.adders all the time. I just want to do vatters or vatters or whatever you want to call it. And then I want this kind of global flag. I want one that's combined with my display flag now. So I can do computed.and, again another macro. And this is going to take these two bools and AND them together for me. So that's my mixin. Okay. If I want to put it to use, I'm going to come back here to my login validations, and then I'm just going to import it. If I can remember, okay. So this is kind of at the root of my application. So that's cookbook, and then it's in the mixins folder. So now I've got this in here. And instead of just exporting this mixin directly, I'm just going to make this a variable. And then I'm going to do, what I'm going to do is reopen this mixin. And this is something you can do to anything that extends from Ember. So controllers, routes, Ember.objects. You can reopen them all and add additional functionality. So that's what I'm doing. So I'm adding this mixin to that mixin. And that's going to be great. And then I need to export something, right? So I'm going to export default. I want to add even more to this. So I'm going to reopen this again. And I want just a little bit more convenience. So I want to know if my username is invalid. And that's going to be Ember computed, .and, right? That's my display validation because I know that that's in there. And then I'm going to do adders username is invalid. So now I have a convenience property around whether my username is invalid and if I want to show that message. And I'm going to do the same, inviting the copy and paste demons to come and visit me. I'm sure it'll be fine. Yeah, that's a little bit wordier than I want, but okay. So I'm going to save that. And I don't need to change my controller, right, because that's already importing this mixin. So it's already being mixed in. I do need to make a change, though, because now when I try to submit, I don't want to display my errors until the user has interacted with my form, right? So if you submitted and it was invalid, at that point, then we want to say, okay, so now we want to set our display validation flag to false. Oh, no, we want to set it to true. That's a bug waiting to happen. Okay, so I'll do that, and then in my template, I can just kind of use these conveniences. So I can say username is invalid, and save myself like 9 whole keystrokes here. Yeah. Oh. And then here. Okay, so I'll save that, and then everything else should remain the same, right? My action is still going to hit submit login, and we should be able to just refresh this. So now I don't immediately get my validation messages, but as soon as I try to log in, then I get my errors because I've now swapped that flag, and all the computed properties just update. We still have a problem though, and I mentioned this earlier. This controller is a singleton, and I've just been mixing in all these properties into it and setting state on them. So now when I go and browse to my login, my index page, and I come back here, everything's the same, right? Nothing's changed. So if I had something in here, I can come back, it's still there. Maybe that's a feature, maybe, but probably not, right? So there's 2 ways we can kind of deal with this, and there's a way that works, and there's kind of the better way. So we're going to do the way that works because that's how we do things, and it's really simple. I'm just going to add a route, and so ember.route.extend, and I need a hook here called reset controller, and this is going to receive the controller itself and a boolean to tell me if the route is actually exiting. And then when you're overriding some of these hooks or implementing some of these hooks yourself, you want to call this underscore super. That's basically just going to let Ember do any plumbing things that it needs to do. So basically you just pass on through. All right. And then with that, I can just say, hey, if this is exiting, I want to send an action to the controller called reset data. Good old lint. Okay. So now we need an action in our controller named reset data. Oops. And this is very simply just going to clear all the things. So we're setting that to false. Username to null. Okay. This getter and setter syntax, if it looks weird, this is kind of what all the cool kids use for Ember. You can just totally say this dot set as well. It's kind of a matter of preference. I actually find this a bit more readable, but your mileage may vary. So now, assuming I did not just introduce a huge bug, when I try to log in and I get my error and I leave my route, that action should have been hit, so when I come back now, all my state is cleared. So that's kind of cool, but slightly better way to do that. And I'm not gonna, we're just gonna kind of skip to it, right? So if I come back to my controller now, I've got my reset data action is gone. The only other thing that's changed here is now instead of validations.isValid, I've got model.isn't.stuff, right? So everything's prefixed with model now. I do have another computed property here. So this is how you do a computed property. If you're not using a macro, you basically explicitly say which properties you're depending on. So unlike an angular function or a knockout observable, it's not going to try to guess for you. You tell it explicitly what it's going to observe. All I'm doing here is very simple. I'm basically saying if we care about showing validations, then look at the valid state and disable or enable the button. My mixin is gone. My mixin is not being applied to the controller anymore. And that's pretty much the extent here. My validations have not changed whatsoever, so this is the same. If I go to my template now, all of this is also the same. Again, the only difference is I'm using model dot in front of everything now. So you can probably guess what's coming. I created a model, right? And my model is just an ember.object. I'm initializing the properties, but really it's just taking my mixin, just like the controller was. So if I were to have refactored this, all I really did was make this model, put the mixin here instead, and change everything in my controller to use the model, which is what I should have done in the first place. So that's cool. And then my route now is a little different. I don't use it reset anymore, but I do have this model hook because that's how you get your data, right? So anytime that you transition into this route, this model hook is called, and I'm going to be creating my login model, and I always debate if I should say this. This controller is the only black magic you'll see in this presentation. It's required by the validations library to the container basically is what allows you to do injections into your objects. If your object doesn't have a container, you can't use ember.inject. So because of that, the validator library needs it to kind of invoke its validators. So that's why that's there. But other than that, it's pretty straightforward. So now we come back here. I can do stuff again. So now my button's disabled, right, until it's everything's good. And then if I do leave this page and come back, my model hook gets called, the model gets reset, and then that flows downhill and all the template gets re-rendered and everything is clear. Any questions about the demo? Anything weird that you saw? All right. So wrapping up. So pros for Ember. Ember CLI does a lot of stuff for you. Really, Ember init is all you need to start an Ember app and start developing, like just developing, which is pretty cool. It iterates quickly, so they're constantly fixing bugs, adding features. The 2.0 cycle has been kind of interesting. They've been doing mostly performance builds, so not a lot of new features, but a lot of performance fixes. And then Ember is, in my opinion, really built to handle multi-page apps. So if you're not looking for something that's going to have a lot of screens, like independent screens, nested routes, etc., Ember might disappoint you a little bit. It's really, like I said, the router does a lot of work for you. So if you need that, Ember should be a consideration for you. That, combined with the kind of 1,500 add-ons, makes it pretty easy to find functionality that you might need to leverage. The cons, I hope you like what Ember CLI does, because you're going to be going against the grain if you want to change it. Ember likes its convention, so if you're not using the kind of routes controllers templates or the pods, you're going to have to build your own custom resolver to tell Ember where your stuff is. Same thing with the build. If you don't like the broccoli stuff, you want to use Webpack, you can, but you're going to be going against the grain. There's no real good documentation for it. You're in for a world of pain. And you're going to lose the ability to just quickly add those add-ons. A lot of them don't support you if you're not using Ember CLI. And still, Ember moves pretty fast still. So if you're not, you can get caught off guard if you're looking at some buzz on the blogs and stuff, and it's like, oh, this feature looks cool, and you realize it's really just Canary, or it's like 6 months out. But people are already talking about it and like writing applications with it, because why wouldn't they? And then the last one is it's yucky. Like somebody told me this. It's so yucky. Yeah, if you don't like, Ember likes to deal with property names and function calls as strings. If you don't like to do that, you're going to have a hard time liking Ember, because everything is this set this property name, action, actions are referenced by string, etc. So there's that to consider. And that's all I have. So thank you. And that said, if you do have any questions, then feel free to wander up to me, or if you want to just punch me in the face, just give me like 5 seconds and I'll run out. That's good. Oh, pizza. I guess take some or all of it.
Great, thanks. You have any other questions then? So next month we have JavaScript development in Visual Studio. And then following that, I'll do a CoffeeScript meeting, and if there's any other people who want to present, just let us know. I'm always looking for things to hear about. So, cool. Thank you.
Thank you.